Okay, guys, so this PowerPoint is going to be focusing on the third part of the blood vessels lecture. So just quickly going over what we finished up with last time. We had discussed the two type of circulations we have in our body. One that I mentioned was referred to as the systemic blood pressure, and the second one was pulmonary, sorry, I should say systemic circulation, and the second one was pulmonary circulation. Systemic circulation, as I mentioned, implied that blood starts from the left side of the heart. It is an oxygenated blood. It goes throughout the body, passing through the elastic arteries, muscular arteries, arterioles, meta-arterioles, capillaries where the exchange takes place, and eventually that blood becomes deoxygenated in the capillary beds and gets picked up by the venules, which empties into veins and eventually gets picked up by the two largest blood vessels or two largest veins called superior and inferior vena cava. Now, this blood goes back to the right side of the heart. The second circulation, which is called the pulmonary, as in your lungs, starts from the right side of the heart. It is deoxygenated blood, and this blood basically goes to your lungs, hence the word pulmonary. This is where the gas exchange takes place, where your blood gives up its carbon dioxide, which eventually be exhaled out through your lungs. And at the same time, it will be picking up oxygen and making your blood from deoxygenated to oxygenated. This blood eventually ends in the left side of the heart and begin its circulation through systemic circulation. Now, since we are focusing on this PowerPoint on systemic circulation and systemic blood pressure, we're going to switch gears and talk about the type of blood pressure associated with systemic circulation. Now, if you have ever gone to the doctor, what you have noticed is that when they do your blood pressure, you will get two numbers. You get a relatively larger number and a smaller number. The units for these two numbers is millimeter of mercury, or mmHg. The larger number is typically for a healthy individual is about 120, and the smaller number, or the second number, is range between 70 to 80 millimeter of mercury. What these numbers represent is when your ventricle, which is basically the part of the heart responsible for pumping blood out of the heart, more specifically left ventricle, that is going to pump blood through systemic circulation, contracts, and through its contraction, it's basically going to push blood out of the aorta. Now, this type of pressure, when ventricles is going to contract, so the keyword here is contraction of the left ventricle. It's going to create a significant pressure on which blood vessel? Aorta, which is the largest elastic artery we have in our body, and it starts from the left ventricle. Now, when you contract to push blood out of the aorta, that causes the stretching of the aorta. Remember that aorta is elastic artery, which means what you're doing is you're basically stretching this aorta by pushing a lot of blood through it. Now, that is going to create the highest pressure, which is about 120 millimeter of mercury for a healthy individual. Now, when you're pushing this fluid, your blood out of these blood vessels, what you're doing is you're stretching the tissue and you're actually storing energy into the elastic tissue. Now, going back, there is a bolded vocabulary called systolic pressure. The word systolic implies contraction. Sorry, I don't have my thing, so I can't write. So anytime you hear the word systolic, it implies, wow, this is going to take me a long time, guys, sorry. It refers to the word or the process called contraction. When we have the word diastolic pressure, on the other hand, it implies relaxation. So, what I've done during the systolic portion of the heart, or during the process called systole, I contracted my ventricles. I put a lot of pressure to push blood out of my main blood vessels, on the left-hand side being aorta. Because this tissue is very elastic, I'm going to store some of that energy from the contraction into the elastic tissue of the elastic artery or aorta. So when my heart starts to go from contraction to relaxation, what happens is basically you drop the pressure, right? There is no force behind this anymore. So what happens to aorta in that time? Remember, elastic is known for recoiling ability. So as ventricle starts to relax, aorta starts to recoil, and that gives it the ability to maintain pressure. Now, again, because the contraction is not there anymore, the pressure will not be as strong as 120, but it's still significant enough, ranging between 70 to 80 millimeter of mercury. This is again energy that is stored from the systolic process, or the process called systole, which is basically contraction of the heart. Now, a couple of words you guys need to be familiar with is pulse pressure. For what? Pulse pressure implies a difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure. So if you go to the previous slide, we said that systolic is typically about 120. Diastolic, we usually say about 80 to keep it consistent. So if I want to calculate my pulse pressure, all I'm doing is 120 minus 80 millimeter of mercury, and that basically is equal to 40 millimeter of mercury for pulse pressure. The other component is something known as MAP, or mean aortic pressure. This is the difference in the pressure, in the actual pressure, and the fluctuation in the pressure of the heart. So what does that mean? So understand that you cannot constantly maintain an exact pressure. So there's fluctuation between your pressure. Sometimes your pressure is 122, sometimes 119, sometimes 120, sometimes a little bit higher or a little bit lower. So what I can create is something called mean aortic pressure, and it's calculated as follows. Diastolic pressure, which in this case we usually typically say it's 80, right? Plus the pulse pressure that I calculated, which was 40 from the previous one, divided by 3. Notice that when you're doing these calculations, to make sure it is done correctly, you need to first take the pulse pressure, divide it by 3, and then add it to 80. So you shouldn't say 80 plus 40 divided by 3, okay? It's 40 divided by 3 plus 80. So it's going to be definitely a larger number. Now, on the previous PowerPoint, we actually took a look at this chart. When we looked at the pressure changes, I mentioned that the most significant drop in pressure is associated with arterioles, which is what is represented in this region. You can kind of see it's relatively flat until it reaches the arteriole, when you have this significant dip. The area or the line that is running in the middle is representing mean arterial pressure. The top is systolic pressure and the bottom one is diastolic. So systolic, diastolic, and the middle one is mean blood pressure, or basically mean aortic pressure, which as we calculated earlier. Now, the second thing I also mentioned, but to kind of review, when I talk about drop in pressure or creating high resistance, we're talking about arterial. But if I talk about, and it's not present on this, if I talk about velocity, how fast blood passes through your blood vessels, the lowest velocity would be present inside your capillaries, because that's where the exchange happens. So you want the blood to move as slowly, that basically enables the tissue and blood to exchange their gases and nutrients. If they're rapidly moving by the side of each other, that exchange will not take place as effectively. So this slide is focusing on pulmonary circulation. We already mentioned it, we kind of discussed this earlier, so just to kind of review, if you take a look at the picture I have here, you have your heart at the center. Remember that this is a mirror image or the anatomical positioning. So this side is the left side, and the side that is represented in blue is the right side. So from the right side of the heart, you see blood going up and out to your left and to your right lung. And this is where the gas exchange takes place, where you can see in this picture, this is your blood vessels and this is your lung tissue. So notice lungs. So what you see here is the CO2 is going into the lungs and O2 is getting into the blood vessels. And again, this blood, you might not be familiar with the word atrium, but this blood is going to be oxygenated eventually and returned back to the left side of the heart, which we see in red. Kind of again review of what we already discussed. Systemic arteries are going to be carrying oxygenated blood from the heart toward the body. So body can use, the systems of the body can use that oxygenated blood. The most important blood vessels, as we mentioned, is the elastic artery called aorta. Systemic veins, by the time it returns blood back to your heart, there are the two main blood vessels, which are superior and inferior vena cavas. You don't really need to know the superficial vein versus multi-vein bundles, which we refer to them as venous plexus. Interesting information, but you don't really need to know that. So the last part of this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about fetal circulation. Now, we're not going to go into details. We're not going to learn about the we're not going to learn about the smallest changes or differences between fetus versus a human adult blood circulation. But there are some key concepts that I do want you guys to know. So let's take a look at this first. So when we're looking at a fetus, one of the first things you need to notice is that because fetus is within a fluid, within the womb, or within the placenta, if you want to be more specific, the baby or fetus cannot breathe, which basically implies that they don't have a pulmonary circulation because their lungs is non-functional. So you cannot take the blood from the right side of the heart and pump it to the lungs to be oxygenated. So when blood goes back to the right side of the heart, which you see right here, this blood cannot circulate into the lung tissue. So you need to prevent that. So one of the key concepts. The second thing is because babies do not eat, they don't need to clean up the food they eat. So another thing that they need to bypass is the liver. So since their digestive system is not fully functional because they're not eating anything, they don't really need liver to clean what they actually ate. So liver, which is responsible for detoxification of your food or nutrients that have been absorbed into your blood, is also kind of not necessary or as functional in the case of the fetus. So let's take a look at this picture in a little bit, or kind of a closer view of the differences. So one of the main differences, again, as I mentioned, you don't have functional lungs because you're in a fluid environment. So if blood is coming through the vena cavas, you see superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, and they're coming into the right atrium, they're gonna go to the bottom chamber, which is the right ventricle, And notice here, what you want, or what it typically does, is the blood is going to go through these two blood vessels you see right here and right here to go to your lungs, or to the fetus lungs. But in reality, lungs aren't functioning. So what can I do? So what you do is you make this connection you see right here. This connection is called ductus, as in a duct, arteriosus, as an arteries. So ductus arteriosus is duct between two arteries. Ductus arteriosus is a way that allows the bypass of the pulmonary circulation by pushing all of the blood from the pulmonary circulation, which is this one, into the aorta, which is the systemic circulation. So blood does not go to the lungs, but it rather goes to the aorta. Now, another way that we can basically prevent blood from going into the right side of the heart and eventually into the lungs is as blood enters the right side of the heart, which is the top part called the right atrium, you can just take that blood and directly transfer it to the left-hand side. Take the blood from the right top chamber, which is the right atrium, and transfer it to the left atrium. To do that, you have this opening right here, okay? This opening is called foramen, sorry, this is backward, foramen ovale. Foramen means a hole, ovale means oval. So basically this is a oval hole. Again, what is this job? It is opening between the right atrium, what we see here in blue, and left atrium, which is you see as this circle. So basically it takes blood from the right hand side and switch it to the left. Last one we said we don't really need the liver to detox your blood, because the blood's actually coming from the mother and it's supposed to be already detoxed. So you're basically bypassing your liver by creating a duct called ductus venosus. Ductus venosus, which again, it's connecting the blood that is coming from the mother through the umbilical vein directly into the inferior vena cava, or IVC. So here is the umbilical vein in red. This that you see in blue is the inferior vena cava. So you merge them together and you bypass the liver. So liver is basically not doing any of those functions. Now, at the moment of the birth, when the baby takes its first breath, what happens is that baby starts to basically activate or start to initiate the use of its pulmonary circulation. So the lungs start to be inflated, which means the pulmonary circulation is going to start to work. So we need to close the two structures that prevented blood to go through the pulmonary circulation. The first one we mentioned, the second one we mentioned or discussed was foramen ovale, which was going from the right side of the heart to the left side. When that is closed up, it becomes fossa ovalis. So after birth, it becomes fossa ovalis. What we identify as ductus arteriosus, the connection between the two arteries. This one, the blue one that's going to the lungs, and it emptied into the aorta, ductus arteriosus, that connection is also closes and it becomes a ligament. So we call it ligamentum arteriosum. Lastly, because there is no more umbilical vein, then that that duct or that connection that bypass the liver called ductus venosus become what? Ligamentum venosum. You don't need to know the last two in the table. So what you need to focus on is what is foramen ovale, what's ductus arteriosus and ductus venosus, what is their job, and after birth, basically after baby starts to take its breath, and what they will become. Remember, these structures are basically become non-functional as the baby is born, take its first breath, and continue to grow.